Hey everyone. In this practice video, we're going to be using truth tables to test for whether statements are tautologies, contradictions, or simply run-of-the-mill contingent statements. The difficulty level for this video is going to be intermediate. So with all of that said, let's just go ahead and get started. So before we get started, just a quick reminder, right? A statement is a tautology when it's true on every single row. It's a contradiction when it's false on every single row. And it's contingent when neither of those holds, right? So you'll have at least one row that's true and at least one row that's false, right? Okay, so with that said, I'm just going to dive right into this. My advice is pause the video and solve these yourself first, and then go ahead and follow along with me to see how you did. So let's go ahead and start. So we have this statement. It's a conditional. Before we can evaluate the conditional, we're going to have to go ahead and start by evaluating what's inside of these square brackets. The connective within this square bracket here is this conditional, but before we can evaluate that, we have to evaluate the antecedent, which is this negation. And before we can evaluate the negation, we have to start with this conjunction in here. I know, lots and lots of fun. As always, when you're evaluating these statements, you start with the innermost connective and then you work your way out. Okay, so starting with our conjunction of A and B, true and true is true, true and false is false, false and true is false, false and false is false. And of course, that's because conjunctions are true if and only if both conjuncts are true. Otherwise, the conjunction evaluates to false. Now here we have a negation, so all we have to do is negate these values. So that's going to be false, true, true, true. And now we have everything that we need to evaluate this conditional. So if the antecedent is false and the consequent, which is A in this case, is true, then this is going to be true. Truth implies truth, that's going to be true. True implies false, that's going to be false. And true implies false, that's going to be false as well. And always make sure that you double, triple, and quadruple check your work. I have a tendency of making a really annoying mistake where I'll just look at the wrong truth values. So I'm just going to double check all of this to make sure that I did it all correctly. So these are all definitely right. And the negation, those are all definitely right. And then the conditional runs from this negation to the letter A. So false implies true, that's true. Truth implies truth, that's truth. Truth implies false, that's false. Truth implies false, that's false. Okay, that's just me double checking. And now that we have all of that, we can go ahead and evaluate the main connective, right? So here we're going to be looking at B, and we're going to be looking at this conditional right here. So truth implies truth, that's going to be true. False implies true, that's going to be true. Truth implies false, that's going to be false. And false implies false, that's going to be true. Here is our main connective, and as you can see, it's not a tautology and it's not a contradiction, so it must be a contingent statement. And that's all there is. So let's just move on to the next one. We'll go ahead and we'll get a little bit closer just to make this easier to look at. Okay, so here our main connective is this conditional right here. I'll go ahead and I'll start by evaluating the antecedent, right? And the antecedent in this case is this negation, but we can't evaluate the negation until we've evaluated the biconditional. Now remember that biconditionals are true when both of their components have the same truth value, and they're false when both of their components have different truth values. So here, for the first row, N and M are both true, so that's going to be true. And for the last row, N and M are both false, so that's going to be true. And it's only in these middle rows that they have different truth values. So that's where those are going to turn out false. Now, all a negation does is just invert truth values. So if we've got true, false, false, true, then we know that this is going to be false, true, true, false. And now we have the antecedent. So let's go ahead and evaluate the consequent. In this case, the consequent is a conjunction. One of those conjuncts is a negation, so we have to start there. M is true, false, true, false. So the negation is going to be false, true, false, true. And now that we have that negation worked out, we can work on the conjunction. N and not M, true and false is going to be false. True and true is going to be true. False and false is going to be false. False and true is going to be false. And now we have everything that we need to evaluate the conditional. False implies false is going to be true. True implies true is going to be true. True implies false is going to be false. And false implies false, that's going to be true. And here we have another contingent statement. And now let's move on to the final truth table. There we go. Try to get this to zoom in a little bit. Okay, that's really not as smooth as I would like, but well, whatever. Technical difficulties and all that. Okay, so just doing the same thing here. So let's go ahead and start with the antecedent with H implies J. Truth implies truth, that's true. Truth implies false, that's false. False implies true, that's true. False implies false, that's true. Now let's go ahead and evaluate the consequent. So the consequent is a negation. Inside of that negation, we have a conjunction, but in order to evaluate that conjunction, we have to evaluate this negation first. So let's do that. So J is true, false, which means that not J is going to be false, true, true. And that seems to have not, there we go. Now that we have that negation, we can evaluate the conjunction. True and false is false. True and true is true. False and false is false. False and true is false. And now that we have that conjunction, we can go ahead and evaluate this negation, which will evaluate to true, false, true, true. And now that we have everything that we need, we can evaluate this conditional. Truth implies truth, that's true. False implies false, that's true. Truth implies truth, that's true. And truth implies truth, that's true. So we have all of our truth values here. And it turns out that this statement is true on every single row. So this is a tautology. And that's all there is. And that pretty much wraps that up. I'll be posting more practice videos for probably forever. So if you'd like to watch those, or if you'd like to watch more videos about logic or philosophy more generally, you should consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.